She was 7 years old, alone in a blizzard, and the only thing standing between her and the cold was a dog with a broken leg. Rex had positioned himself over Lily Bennett's small body the moment she stopped moving, lowering his broad chest against her back, pressing his warmth into her, turning himself into a wall against the wind. His injured rear leg shook violently under the strain. The old shrapnel wound that had never fully healed burned in the cold the way it always did in winter, deep and relentless, like a fire buried in the bone. But he did not move. He did not sit. He held his position over that little girl in the snow with everything he had left. He had done this before, in a different country, in a different kind of storm, for a different Bennett. Lily's fingers had stopped trembling. That was the part that would have frightened anyone who knew what it meant, when the shaking stops, when the body grows quiet and still in the cold. That is not peace. That is the body running out of fight. Rex pressed closer. A security camera blinked at the top of the hill above them. Daniel Carter was 61 years old, and he had learned long ago that the body wakes before the mind when something is wrong. He was in his kitchen, still in his flannel shirt, his first cup of coffee untouched and steaming on the counter, when his phone buzzed with the motion alert from the front gate camera. He picked it up. He looked at the screen. He set the coffee down. He was outside in 30 seconds. The cold hit him the moment he came through the front door, but he was already moving, already down the path, his eyes fixed on the small shape collapsed at the bottom of his driveway. He unlatched the gate and pushed through into the snow and crossed the distance in long strides, dropping to his knees beside the child. The dog was on his feet in an instant. Rex placed himself between Daniel and Lily, his body low and steady, his amber eyes fixed on the stranger with the calm, unblinking focus of an animal that has spent years reading the difference between a threat and a protector. He didn't growl, he didn't lunge, he simply stood there and made it clear, with every line of his body, that this child was his, and nothing would reach her without going through him first. Daniel stopped. He knew that posture. He had seen it in military working dogs overseas, that specific, terrible stillness that said, "I am not afraid of you, and I will not move." "Easy," Daniel said quietly. His voice dropped to the low, even tone of a man who has spent a lifetime giving commands in situations that required absolute calm. "Easy, buddy. I've got her. I've got her." Something in those words, the cadence, the steadiness, something that lived in the voice of a man who had stood in difficult places and not broken, reached the dog. Rex held his position for one more long moment, his eyes moving across Daniel's face with an almost unsettling intelligence. Then he stepped aside, just enough. Daniel reached into the snow and gathered Lily into his arms. She was so light it frightened him. He pulled her against his chest and turned back toward the house, and Rex followed without being told, limping through the deep snow, his damaged leg dragging, his eyes never leaving the man carrying the child. Inside, Daniel wrapped Lily in a heavy wool blanket and sat her in the armchair closest to the heating vent. He put a mug of warm water in her small hands. He crouched in front of her, at her level, the way you approach a child you don't want to frighten any further than she already is. Her eyes opened slowly, dark eyes, serious in the way that children's eyes become serious when they have seen things children shouldn't have to see. "What's your name?" Daniel asked. "Lily," she said. Her voice was barely there. "Lily Bennett." "Lily." He said it like it mattered, because it did. "Where do you live?" "Clement Street, apartment 4C. She had clearly been taught to know that by heart, the address of a child whose mother wanted to make sure she could always find her way home. "Sir," her voice caught just for a moment and then steadied again with a kind of courage that had no business being in a 7-year-old's chest. "My mama didn't come home last night." Those words fell into the warm room and stayed there. Daniel looked at this little girl, her soaked boots, her thin pink jacket that was never meant for a storm like this, her dark hair still tangled from the bed she had woken in alone, and he felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in years. Not pity, something older and heavier than pity, something that lived in the part of a man that forms long before he ever puts on a uniform. "Okay," he said, "we're going to find her, I promise you." He stood and reached for his phone, and that was when he saw the dog clearly for the first time. Rex had settled near the door, watching Daniel with the patient, measuring attention of an animal that never fully stands down. He was a large German shepherd, broad through the chest, his coat dark and dense, and still dusted with snow along his back. There was a power to him that age and injury had not taken. Something in the way he held himself, upright and deliberate, that spoke of years of training and the kind of work that leaves a mark on an animal the same way it leaves a mark on a man. His back left leg was visibly damaged. The muscle had wasted in the way that comes from old trauma, shrapnel most likely, or a blast, and he carried it with the quiet dignity of a creature that has accepted its wound without letting the wound define what it is. Around his neck was an old collar, worn leather, and attached to it a small metal tag. Daniel crossed the room slowly and crouched beside the dog. Rex watched him without moving. Daniel reached out the way you reach toward any animal you respect, slowly, without sudden movement, letting the dog read his intention before his hand arrived. He turned the tag over in his fingers and tilted it toward the light. He read it once. Then he read it again. Rex, military working dog, handler, Staff Sergeant Michael Bennett, USMC, Canine Unit. Daniel did not move for a long moment. The room was quiet. The heater hummed. Outside, the snow continued to fall against the windows in long, silent sweeps. And Daniel Carter knelt on his living room floor and held a dog tag in his fingers and felt the specific weight of a name he had not heard spoken in 2 years.
Michael Bennett. He said it quietly, under his breath, barely a sound at all. He had known Michael Bennett. Not closely. The Marine Corps was vast and deployments scattered men across the world like seeds, but he had known the name, the way every Marine in that task force had known it. A quiet man, unremarkable in the ways that don't matter, extraordinary in the ways that do. The kind of Marine other Marines described not with stories of bravado, but with a particular silence, a respectful pause before they spoke that told you everything. Michael Bennett had died overseas shielding his unit from an ambush. He had a wife named Grace. He had a daughter. Daniel looked across the room at Lily, wrapped in her blanket, holding her mug in both small hands, watching him with her father's serious eyes. He looked back at Rex. The dog was watching him too, and in the amber depths of those eyes, trained and scarred and loyal beyond any measure Daniel had words for, he saw something that stopped his breath for just a moment. Not grief exactly, something that had moved through grief and come out the other side, something that had decided, in the absence of the man it was built to serve, to transfer every ounce of that devotion to the man's child and simply never stop. Daniel placed his hand on Rex's head. The dog leaned into it, just slightly, just for a single moment, and then straightened again, his eyes moving back to Lily. Daniel stood up. His jaw was set in the way it had been set in every difficult moment of the last 20 years. "Lily," he said, "I need you to tell me where your mama works." They drove through the snow in Daniel's truck, Lily in the back seat with Rex pressed solidly against her side, his large warm body absorbing every shiver that moved through her. She had one hand buried deep in the fur at her neck, and she was looking out the window at the white streets passing by with the focused stillness of a child who is keeping herself together through sheer concentration.
Daniel drove to the first address she gave him, then the second. At the third, a mid-rise office building on the edge of the commercial district, its lobby lights still burning in the early morning gray, Rex lifted his head sharply from the back seat. A low sound came from somewhere deep in his chest. Not a bark, something more certain than a bark, something that was less a sound and more a statement. "Here," Lily said immediately. "She's here. Rex knows." They found Grace Bennett in a maintenance corridor on the basement level. She was collapsed against the concrete wall near a utility closet, her cleaning cart still beside her, her mop handle leaning against the wall above her like something left mid-task. Her phone lay dead on the floor near her outstretched hand. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was shallow and slow in the cold air of the corridor, each breath just barely arriving before the next one was needed. She had worked 3 consecutive overnight shifts. She had eaten almost nothing across those 3 days, saving what little there was for Lily, the way mothers do, quietly, without making it a sacrifice, just making it a habit. She had simply kept moving until the last possible moment, and then her body had made the decision for her. "Grace," Daniel was on his knees beside her, his hand firm and warm on her face, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of a man who has talked people through the worst moments of their lives. "Grace, listen to me. Lily is safe. She is right here. I need you to stay with me." Grace's eyes opened, slowly, with tremendous effort. They moved across the ceiling of the corridor and then found her daughter standing in the doorway, Rex pressed against Lily's leg, both of them watching her with the same expression, the same desperate, relieved, exhausted love. "Baby," Grace whispered. It was barely a sound, but Lily heard it across the corridor the way children hear their mothers across any distance. She crossed the floor in 4 steps and dropped to her knees and put both arms around her mother's neck and held on with everything she had. "I found you, Mama," she whispered into her mother's hair. "Rex helped me find you. He didn't stop. Even with his hurt leg, he didn't stop." Rex walked forward into the corridor. He lay down on the cold concrete floor beside them both, beside the woman and the child, beside the family he had inherited from the man he had loved first. He rested his chin on Grace's ankle. His eyes drifted half-closed. He had been awake for more than 12 hours. He had walked through a blizzard on a damaged leg. He had shielded a child with his own body in temperatures that should have driven him inside. But he lay on that cold floor now with the deep, settled stillness of an animal that has completed what it set out to do. He had found her. His family was together. He could rest. The doctors told Daniel privately, in a hallway that smelled of antiseptic and quiet urgency, that another hour in that corridor would have told a very different story. Daniel stood alone in that hallway for a moment after the doctor walked away. He looked down at his hands. He thought about a Marine he had never met face to face but had always respected. He thought about what that man had given and what he had left behind. He thought about a little girl walking through a blizzard in a jacket too thin for the cold, talking to a limping dog to keep her courage up. Then he took out his phone and started making calls. He called a veterans advocacy organization he had worked with for years. He called a benefits coordinator he had known since his second deployment. He called a friend at the VA who had owed him a favor for a long time and had been patient about collecting it. He made 4 calls in 20 minutes, standing in that hospital hallway in his flannel shirt with snow still on his boots, and by the time he walked back through the door to where Lily was sitting, Rex lying across her feet beneath the chair, both of them exhausted and still, the process that Grace Bennett had been fighting through alone for 18 months had begun to move. He sat down beside Lily. After a long, quiet moment, she said, "My daddy had Rex in the war." "I know," said Daniel. She looked up at him with her father's eyes. "You knew my daddy?" "I knew he was a very good Marine," said Daniel. "One of the best." Lily looked at the doors her mother was behind. "He told Mama that Marines never leave their families behind." A pause, small and heavy. "But then he didn't come home." Daniel looked down at Rex, lying across Lily's feet in the blue waiting room light, his chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of deep, exhausted sleep. This dog who had crossed an ocean and survived a blast and walked through a blizzard on a broken leg and never, not once, not for a single day, abandoned the family of the man he had served. "He didn't want to leave," Daniel said quietly. "Men like your father never want to leave. They just sometimes have no choice." He paused. "But the people they leave behind, those people are never really alone, not if the rest of us do our jobs." In the weeks that followed, things began, slowly, imperfectly, the way real recovery always begins, to change. The delayed survivor benefits that had been buried in paperwork for 18 months were approved and released. Grace found stable work with hours that let her sleep. Daniel quietly arranged for a veteran family support fund to cover 3 months of expenses while she recovered her strength. He checked in. He showed up on Tuesday afternoons and Saturday mornings. He fixed a leaking faucet without being asked and drove Lily to school twice when Grace had a medical appointment, and sat at their kitchen table drinking bad coffee and listening when Grace needed to talk about Michael and didn't have anyone who had known what his world looked like. Rex received a full veterinary evaluation, the first comprehensive examination of his injured leg since the injury itself. His pain was managed properly for the first time in years. He was fitted with a new service vest, deep green with a brass clasp, and he wore it with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything. And Lily began to laugh again, slowly, the way light returns after a long winter, in small moments first, then longer ones. Then one afternoon, Daniel arrived at the apartment and heard it through the door before he even knocked, high and completely unguarded, and he stood in the hallway with his hand on the doorframe and felt something release in his chest that he realized he had been holding for a very long time. The ceremony was held on a cool October morning at a Veterans Memorial Park on the edge of the city. Modest and quiet, a dedication in Michael Bennett's honor, organized by Daniel and a small group of Marines from the same task force. There was a folded flag. There were photographs. There were men in their 60s, standing straight in civilian clothes, with the permanent posture of people who never fully leave the service, their eyes clear and their jaws set, and their hands clasped in front of them in the specific way of men who were holding emotion by an act of long practice. Lily stood at the front, beside the small granite plaque bearing her father's name. Rex sat at her left side in his new vest, perfectly still, his dark eyes moving slowly and steadily across the gathering, reading faces, reading the space, never fully off duty, never fully at rest. A working dog at a ceremony honoring his handler, present in the way only he could be present, carrying something no medal or plaque could carry. When the ceremony ended and the gathered Marines began to move and speak quietly among themselves, Lily turned to Daniel. She reached out and took his hand in both of hers, the small, deliberate grip of a child who knows exactly who she is holding on to and why. She looked up at him. "Daddy said Marines never leave their families behind." She looked down at Rex. She placed her free hand gently on the top of the dog's broad head. Rex leaned into it with his eyes half closed. "You didn't either," she said. "Neither of you." Daniel Carter had held himself together in burning buildings and ambushed convoys and hospital waiting rooms and grave sites. He had developed over 20 years a considerable and hard-won capacity for keeping himself composed in moments that demanded it. He found, standing in that park on that October morning, with a 7-year-old girl holding his hand and a war dog leaning against his leg, and the name of a fallen Marine carved in granite before him, that he had reached the outermost edge of what that composure could hold.
He didn't fight it. He stood in the cool October air, in the presence of men who understood, and he let it come. Because some things deserve to be felt fully. Some debts cannot be repaid. Some sacrifices cannot be balanced or measured or adequately honored. Some men walk into the fire knowing they will not walk out, and they do it anyway, because the people beside them matter more than the cost. And the only answer the living can give to that, the only worthy response, is to show up for the families those men left behind. Quietly, steadily, without waiting to be asked. Michael Bennett gave everything he had. A wounded dog gave what remained of his to guard a little girl through the dark. And a retired Marine, woken by a blinking camera on a snowy morning, gave his time and his connections and his presence, and in doing so, received something he hadn't known he was still missing, a reason to keep showing up. None of them called it heroism. They called it what it was: duty, loyalty, love. If this story reached something inside you, if it reminded you of the quiet courage that lives in the people around us, in the animals who guard us without being asked, in the strangers who open their gates on cold mornings and change 3 lives forever, then please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe, carrying with you. And tell us in the comments, has there ever been someone in your life who showed up for you when you had nothing left? Or have you been that person for someone else? We read every one. Until next time, honor the brave, protect the vulnerable, and